And welcome, noble listeners. Thanks for joining us today. We're for our part 2 interview with our dear friend and award-winning author, Dr. Helena Schrader, here to discuss today her historical fiction work, specifically with her Jerusalem Trilogy that takes place during the Crusading era and specifically follows the exploits of the Dablin family, as well as just advice and for prospective historical fiction authors, and also just the importance of historical fiction in education and spreading awareness. So, Dr. Helena, thank you so much for joining us.
You're welcome. It's always a pleasure to be here.
I guess to get started, where did you? What inspired you really to begin writing historical fiction? Because I know, and just kind of as a background to our listeners, your work in the Crusading area is not even, it doesn't even scratch the surface with your entire corpus. You've written novels on quite a few things. I think you've written novels on the Greco-Persian War era. You've written novels recently. You've just been published on in the Battle of Britain subject matter. So it's this is something you've done. You have a lot of experience with.
Right. But okay, I will tell you how this all started, and this may sound a little odd. When I was 4 years old, my father's a professor, and he was sent to the University of Waseda in Japan when I was 2. And I was there for 2 years, and on the way back, we came around the world. That was because the way the U.S. government pays your salaries or your travel is that as long as they do cost construct. You can go anywhere you want as long as it doesn't cost more than what the government would pay for you to go from A to B.
Something I'm intimately familiar with.
And my parents figured out that they could return from Japan to the East Coast of the United States by going west. Is that right? Yeah, going west just as easily as by going east, and thereby stop and see a lot of the world. So we went, first to Hong Kong and Bangkok and Karachi and New Delhi and all these places. And we ended up in Rome. And there they rented a car and they drove from Rome north to Copenhagen and from there to London. Now, this is only relevant because as a 4-year-old, my father took me to the Colosseum in Rome, I should say. When we went to places, my mother and my sisters tended to do the tours and tried to learn, but a 4-year-old really wasn't great on going through the Louvre and whatever. So my father would tend to take me places. So we get to the Colosseum in Rome. And my father and my sisters and mother go on the normal guided tour. And my father takes me, the 4-year-old, by the hand and says, "This is where they fed the Christians to the lions." Wow. My 4-year-old imagination went wild. It was like, where were the lions? Where were the Christians? Do you think they could run away? Could a lion follow you down this path? Could they climb up on the seats? And I honestly think that's where it all started, because that experience meant that the rest of my life, and it helped that we then lived in Europe after that for a number of years. We lived in Brazil. Whenever I went someplace, my mind was always, what was it like to live here? What was it like to be in a castle or to be here or there? So fundamentally, that experience of seeing something at a very young age and having my imagination triggered is why I came to historical fiction. If we're going to be more serious about it, that at some point, you're right, you're reading history. I studied history. I did my PhD in history. I'm very interested in history. Okay, that's just the way it is. Why historical fiction? Was because there's 2 major factors. One, I think you can reach more people because there are really many more people who will read a novel than will sit down and read a serious book of history.
Absolutely.
And the second reason is that there's many things in history that remain cold or not really accessible, not really explicable. But a good novelist can take a few facts and, with an understanding of human nature and an understanding of the period and the surrounding environment, develop plausible theses that can never be proved or disproved, but that provide a greater understanding of what's happening. So a historical fiction can actually expand our understanding of a historical fact, provided, of course, that novelist is being honest about sticking to the facts, doesn't change things, and uses, you know, an understanding of human nature to have people do plausible, incredible things. Historical conviction can be absolutely terrible. It can be disastrous. It can be misleading. It can be
as many of us have experienced, unfortunately. Yes, no, I can totally agree with that statement.
Yeah, and that's sort of the dilemma, is that it can be extremely good or it can be extremely bad, and it's very hard for a reader to know when they pick up a book if this is good or bad, unless they already have some strong basis of the history and can start making those assessments. Okay, maybe I'll stand back and let you add.
Oh no, I think that was a beautiful way of, and spoken very much like a writer. You know what, I think you hit on one of the most important parts, and this is what has always drawn me to good historical fiction, yours included, is it provides such a much a much more enriching experience and almost immersive experience into whatever historical time period it's taking place in. You know, so much of looking at the past, especially from a academic historical standpoint, is it can come off very dry. It's because it's in the past. It's, you know, none of us have ever lived this. None of us have and will ever get to live it. You know, because that time period, that particular time period, and the everyday life, what everyday life was like then, is now gone. And none of us, you know, really know other than what's there, you know, within the historical discipline. You know, none of us have a personal experience with it, and I think historical fiction can fill that gap.
Let me give an example, if I can, Rand. Can I just
absolutely
jump in for a minute? Because we know historically, let's say my character Balin de Ibelin. We know that Balin de Ibelin is born in 1150. This is what the historical record gives us. He was born in 1150. His father died in 1150. His mother remarried in 1150. His stepfather was exiled in 1153. His mother died in 1158. And in 1177, Balin de Ibelin marries the Dowager Queen of Jerusalem and plays a leading role in the Battle of Montgisart. Mm-hmm. That's what the historical record gives us. The historical record also gives us that this man goes on to lead the rear guard at, well, no, more important, when this man is instrumental in trying to stop the coup d'etat by Guy de Lusignan. When that fails, he still tries to reconcile Tripoli with the Lusignan and succeeds in Tripoli coming back and doing homage to Lusignan. He musters with the third largest contingent of troops for the Battle of Hattin, commands the rear guard during the advance towards Hattin, in which the rear guard was under the most pressure, and the Templars suffered extreme losses, and fights his way off the field of Hattin with possibly as many as 3,000 troops, and then asks for a safe conduct from Saladin to remove his wife and children, who are all under the age of 10, from Jerusalem. But of course is asked to stay in Jerusalem. Saladin then sends his own troops to take his wife and children out. Mm-hmm. Balin remains, fights to defend Jerusalem, but also has sorties out of Jerusalem, gets supplies in. He does a very good job of defending Jerusalem, but is overwhelmed. The walls are undermined. And when he's negotiating the surrender of Jerusalem, he offers to stand sure to give up his own person, so that the 30,000 paupers, who he doesn't know from Adam, mm-hmm. don't have to go into slavery. And that's the historical record. Mm-hmm. Putting those dots together cannot be done by a historical biography. I could not. I've written a historical biography. I've done a biography. I did an absolute academic biography of one of the leading the members of the German resistance to Hitler. I had letters, I had diaries, I had the Wehrmacht records, I had his, school records, I had, I could interview people who'd known him. I had, diplomatic records. I had so many sources. I could write a biography of General Friedrich Olbricht that was based entirely on hard, primary sources.
Yep.
I can't do that with Bailey and Evelyn. I have nothing but these little points of fact. Now, any of you out there who are parents, I think you will agree with me that a child who never knew his father, was possibly born posthumously, whose stepfather dies at 3 and whose mother dies at 8, that child is impacted by that situation.
Mm-hmm.
But we don't know what that is. We don't know who raised him. We don't know where he served as a squire. We don't know who knighted him. We don't know what made that man someone who was willing to give up his own freedom for 30,000 paupers.
Yeah.
And that's where the novelist comes in, because as I believe that that's an important thing. I believe that somebody who did that's a supremely Christian gesture of being willing to sacrifice your own freedom for the paupers of Jerusalem deserves to be admired, deserves to be remembered.
Absolutely.
But I can't do that in an official biography. I can only do that with a novel.
Well, and deserves to be remembered. And I think this is where we're both getting at with historical fiction, the importance of historical fiction, which we'll get into later. But is you're expanding the humanity of you're fleshing out the humanity of these people. That these people were human beings just like us, with emotional lives and personal characters and things like that are no different than any of us living today. And almost like maybe this is an imperfect analogy, but almost like sort of like a forensic modeler, with
being exactly right.
Yeah, being given a bare bones skeleton that's been dug up. You're now actually fleshing this person out so that they're not just a blank skeleton. They're actually a relatable person.
That's an analogy. I actually haven't used forensic, but for me, the historical record is a skeleton. And what the novel does is to put the flesh and bones, but also the spirit and the and the character and the emotions and the spirit, I guess, is the best way to put it.
Mm-hmm.
And as remember, if you're resurrecting the dead, you don't want to resurrect the bones. You don't want to resurrect the skeletons. We don't want them, the zombies out there. What we want to resurrect is the spirit, the personality, and that essence, that soul. And that's what you can do with historical fiction. Whereas and as I said, you can't with more recent historical figures. Second World War, my Battle of Britain novel is based almost entirely on autobiographical accounts by pilots. I have 14, 15 books here, all of them autobiographical pilots. What I did there was something different because there's so much information that it's hard for anybody to pull it down and make it into a storyline that to manipulate the storyline. But when you're dealing with Crusades era, or let alone Sparta era history, your bones aren't even complete.
Yeah,
we have
the skeleton's
like
not even complete. Yeah,
we have a couple of ribs, a foot bone, a fragment.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And so you need a little bit more imagination to be able to put things back together again.
Yes, but it does work. Your works. I was always as a kid, I was always very familiar with authors like Louis DeWolf and Rosemary Sutcliffe.
Yes,
those stories. I mean, those stories were a very integral part of my childhood, and I think that's where I credit a lot of my life's passion with history comes from those novels, and comes from the riveting way in which these figures from the past and just a life and a time from the past was essentially resurrected, like you said. So it very much is, I think, just crucial to.
Yeah, that brings us, as I said, to my first point about you can reach more people. So we were talking about the two aspects. One is that you can sometimes create a fuller and more, comprehensible character and dialogue and narrative with fiction. And the other is that you can reach an audience that would never pick up a history book.
Yes.
And one of those audiences, as you said, very, very important, is young people. Why did I study history? Why did you study history? Probably because we read historical fiction. Not because I read some, I didn't read the, Frankish rural settlements Frankish rural settlements in the Latin Kingdom of Jerusalem, to get started on the story, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Going back a little bit to your the Jerusalem Trilogy, which is of course what most people here at Real Crusades History know you the best for. What specifically drew you to write about the crusading era, and specifically what about the de Abelin family that drew you to that?
Yeah. You're going to get back to it. Was travel again. I had planned to go to Egypt, and then there was one of the terrorist attacks on Hatshepsut Temple, and at very short notice, my husband and I, who were living in northern Germany, it was cold and wet and bleak, and we wanted to go somewhere warm and sunny. Anyways, we had to cancel our trip to Egypt, so we looked rapidly, where could we get a quick, fast deal to someplace in the sun, and we went to Cyprus. So we landed in Cyprus, practically on 3 days' notice, very short notice, knew nothing about Cyprus. We leave Berlin, as I say, grim northern Europe.
Yes.
In January, this is miserable stuff. And we landed as the sun was going down behind the palm trees in 72 degrees at 6 o'clock at night, and it was, this is good. So, and that was the first, so I liked Cyprus from the instant the plane landed, and then the next day, because we had nothing planned, so we decided to take a little tour, and we go out on a little tour. And they start talking about Richard the Lionheart having conquered Cyprus. And I'm saying, what? Wait a minute. Richard the Lionheart? He was a king in England. What? Cyprus? I don't get this. Well, of course, things like that, always curiosity. And I just became fascinated. He conquered it in 6 weeks. He conquered it with the loss of 2 people. Yep. 2 nights. It probably was maybe there were others, but actually the records just say he had 2 casualties.
The poor footmen that never get mentioned.
Yeah, you wonder about that, but even so, that's pretty good. You conquered the whole island in 6 weeks with 2 casualties, and the people were actually surrendering to him because they hated the tyrant that they had. And then he sails away, and the Templars come. But then it turns out there's a Latin kingdom, there's a Crusader kingdom that's established on this island for the next 300 years. And it was like, wow. And I never knew about any of this. And I'm going to be very honest. The idea of doing research about a place with palm trees that was 62 degrees and sunny in the middle of January did appeal to me. And I really like going back.
I think it would appeal to a lot of us. Yeah.
So, I really, and we went while we were there, and then we went back. I liked it so much, as I said, so I went back a couple more times, and I ended up climbing up to these incredible castles on the mountain ridge that runs along the north. And these are castles. The cliffs are so steep you can't even build a normal ward, and the towers just jut up out of the rocks. They're castles like you can't imagine. They're just not like anything else. And I've seen the castles, but the Cathar castles. I know not Montgissard. What is the famous Montségur and the ones of southern France? These are still even more dramatic, etc. And then so it's going to these places and then you start reading about the sieges that took place there, and I realized there's this amazing struggle between the king of Cyprus and his barons against the Holy Roman Emperor, and I started reading about this fight, and you start realizing, my God, these people were fighting for basically the rule of law against an autocrat. there's this emperor who's coming in and says, I don't care about your high court, I'm just gonna do whatever I want, and I'm gonna just take away the people's fiefs. And no, they don't have to have any wrongdoing. And I'm not gonna allow you to go to court and because if you're gonna seize me, show me what I've done wrong. You have to prove I've done wrong before a court of law. I have to have a judgment by my peers. And Frederick II saying, no, I'm the emperor. I'm never gonna go to court. I'm going to arrest you. And he does things like he invites people to a banquet. Oh, my dear cousin, come, I want to meet your children and be there. No, and your son should serve me at table. It's such an honor to serve me at table. And please wear these robes I'm giving you, so you won't be in armor and you won't have your swords. And then he smuggles his soldiers in by dark of night. And at the 5th or 6th course, the soldiers come out with their swords on their hilts. And the emperor announces to his guests that he's going to take away his fief, his guest of honor, John the Evelyn. I'm going to take away your fief, and you have to pay me back all the monies that you've had from being regent of Cyprus. And Evelyn says, prove I've done wrongdoing before a court. And if you kill that, I'm not going to do anything. Well, I can kill you, says the emperor. And John says, then kill me. But I am not surrendering my fief or these revenues unless I have a judgment by a court. And the other barons and knights of Cyprus back John de Evelyn. The emperor is forced to back down. Of course, the bishops are jumping up and saying, oh, stop this and all this, blah, blah. And he's forced to back down, and Evelyn's allowed to leave, but he holds 20 hostages, including John de Evelyn's eldest sons. And he tortures those 2 young men who have done nothing. They're just hostages for their father.
Yeah, it was something I definitely wanted to discuss with you, because even with my background, my academic background in the Crusades, even I knew very little of that particular story from the Crusader states period. Like even I didn't know as much about the experience of when Frederick II showed up over there, which even just him doing that was, back, as back in Christendom, was extremely controversial, because technically he was under excommunication, by the papacy, and yet here he is on a essentially crusade of his own making,
which the Pope calls an anti-crusade. But that's why this doesn't show up in Crusader history. People looking at the Crusades aren't going to focus on the civil war between Frederick II and his own barons and it was not just against his own barons, but also against the King of Cyprus, because the King of Cyprus was technically his vassal, because Cyprus was initially part of the Holy Roman Emperor, which is another story, because Lusignan did that to get a crown. But this is the grandson of Aymery de Lusignan, and he opposes the Holy Roman Emperor, and he ultimately wins. He actually gets the Pope to dissolve that bond. But no, it doesn't show up in crusading history, because it's not about Christians fighting Muslims. It's not about defending the holy places. Jerusalem doesn't play a role in this, because Jerusalem at this time is under Muslim control. Yep. So it's not surprising it doesn't show up. But you asked, how did I get interested in the Evelyn's? It was the story of John de Evelyn, of the old Lord of Beirut, and his fight with Frederick, that got me really fascinated in the family. And I wrote a trilogy which focused on this conflict. And then I sat and I looked at it and I said, nobody will ever buy this, because, as you say, nobody knows about it. Nobody cares about it. There is no publisher in the world who is going to look at this story. So I put it away and I wrote about other things. And then the Kingdom of Heaven came out. And I sat in that film and I realized, this is John's father.
Yeah.
And that was, it was like, okay, I know this movie is full of inaccuracies, but let's go back. Let's go back and find out what is true. And that's when I started saying, oh my God, this is such an amazing story. And it just, those 3 generations, Balian, John, and John's son Balian, just fascinate me. And that's because, and they're all very different. They're very different characters, but that's what makes it fun. and there's different, I mean, there's different challenges to that, because Balian is sort of that ideal character who I admire immensely, and I get a lot of criticism, literary criticism, because he's too perfect. And it's sort of like, well, but he really did those things. He really did negotiate between Toulouse, or not Toulouse, between Tripoli and Lusignan. He really did manage to get the, negotiate the surrender of Jerusalem when he had lost everything. He really did negotiate for Richard the Lionheart, but he did all that, but it's like, but he's too perfect, and he's too Christian, and he's so, and his grandson, who is really, actually, you could make him a very negative character. I personally like it, but he's much more flawed, has been much better received by literary critics.
Interesting.
Yeah.
It's, and I think there is room for, I mean, there have been people even in recent history who, maybe if you were to portray them in today's, I think maybe, and this is something we can discuss later when we talk about, advice for authors and maybe pitfalls and recommendations and things like that, is there does seem to be, as stories like Game of Thrones have kind of have tapped into, there is kind of this this atmosphere of postmodern cynicism that seems to be very in vogue, at the moment, where there really are no good guys. Everybody's got a downside and all this kind of thing, which historically may be maybe closer to the mark. However, there have also been people in history who really just were genuinely good people, and noble people, and people who, for whatever reason or whatever circumstances they were in, just were, like you said, maybe we're admirable, absolutely, and maybe there would be accusations of well they're too perfect. Well, it's like, well, no, maybe they're just good, and maybe there's just kind of a weird phobia about that in today's day and age.
I mean, you don't want to get to, what do they call it, Pollyanna or Mary Sue kind of stuff.
Sure.
It's not about making somebody perfect. But it is about admitting that some people may have made choices that were not in their self-interest. And maybe not everybody is, cynical, as you say, and not everybody is inherently intriguing and without principle or without morals and without ethics. It is important, and that is a key thing. As a novelist, you certainly don't want to fall into a trap of making your hero so perfect that people can't identify with them, and they don't seem realistic. So that's going to be a certain balancing act there.
Yes. So you, just real quick, for those who are not familiar with your Jerusalem trilogy, can you just kind of give an overview of the period over which the three books span?
Okay. Yeah. I mean, I mentioned that we know very, very little about Balian's childhood, and he basically enters the historical record in 1177. But I felt that starting with when he's marrying a dowager queen, you can't just start there, because you've got to explain how he gets there. Somehow you have to do that. So I chose to start with the death of his elder brother, because I hypothesized that with his mother dying when he was 8, that and the law of Jerusalem meant you couldn't come into your own inheritance until you were 15. So he had to have a guardian between the age of 8, from the time he was born, essentially. He had to have a guardian until he was 15. That would clearly have been his mother until he was 8. And between 8 and 15, it would have been his elder brother. And that elder brother dies in about 1170. So I chose the moment of his elder brother's death as my starting point, as what I think is the point where he's now a young man of 20, and he's basically being forced out onto his own without having an inheritance, because he's the third son. He has no land, and how he has to make his way in the world from that point. So I start in 1170, which is a very good time, because it's when Alaric is still king. The kingdom's it's almost at its most powerful of the entire period. It extends.
It was kind of the golden age. It was kind of the golden age of the Kingdom of Jerusalem. Yeah.
But it's also the year in which, or shortly after, Baldwin IV has been diagnosed with leprosy. So I used that, and this is fiction. I have Balian become the instructor, the riding instructor, the weapons master for the young Baldwin IV, while William of Tyre is doing the academic work. That way I can introduce William of Tyre, I can introduce Baldwin IV, the issue of the leprosy, and show what's happening in the kingdom, because it brings him in the center of the court. So he's now in the very center of what's going on, and you can see the developments. And this follows, of course, it enables him to meet Maria Comnena. Her marriage to him had to have been voluntary because she was not an heiress, but she was a widow, and a widow could not be forced into any marriage, certainly not a Byzantine princess who had control of Nablus, which was 85 knights and extremely wealthy. She could have remained unmarried if she'd wanted to. Her marriage to Evelyn had to have been voluntary. She at least wanted that marriage. And she wouldn't want him if she didn't know him. So I create the backstory of how that marriage comes to be. And of course, it takes us right to Montgisard, which is an incredibly important battle. It was a Christian victory, as I'm sure everybody listening knows. It was a Christian victory in the territory of Evelyn. And the most recent, academic research believes that it took place in a swampy area, which you can get from William of Tyre, which the local lord, meaning Balian's brother Baldwin, had lured Saladin into. And it really was the Ebelins who masterminded, or at least certainly historically, his brother was responsible. Whether he was also responsible, it's possible because he's named as the only knight who is named. Wow. But as opposed to the others are all barons. So it's possible that he really played a significant role in that battle. And that's where the first book ends. The second book then takes the period from Montgisard, essentially to the fall of Jerusalem, for the next 10 years. And this is the period in which Baldwin is slowly dying, and there's the constant tension of who's going to be his successor. And they know his sister, it's her husband, but it's the issues about who will be her husband. It's an important piece also for understanding Balian, because his brother is a contender for Sibylla's hand, and clearly believed he was going to become her husband and become king. And then when she chooses, or Baldwin chooses, whoever chooses Guy de Lusignan, he is not only misplaced, he not only loses that chance to become king, he becomes a vassal of his rival, Guy de Lusignan. We know that he took this very badly, because when Guy de Lusignan then usurps the throne in 1186, he prefers to leave the country and give up everything, even abandon his wife and son, rather than do homage to Guy de Lusignan. So you have a lot of very powerful emotional issues here. And Balian, as his brother, 5-year younger brother, is obviously involved in all of that. So the novel looks at these, they're all historical developments, but it looks at it through the perspective of a younger brother watching his elder brother practically destroy himself with hate. And then, of course, it takes us through Hattin, and then the siege of Jerusalem, based on the historical record. The historical record for the events of this 10-year period is much, much stronger than what I have for the first book. The first book, I have these 2 data points or 3 data points, and it's speculation, and it's interpolation, and it's imagination. The second book is based very strongly on the historical record, but with a lot of what we were talking about earlier, man, that's just fleshing it out and giving emotions and motives and dialogue and people, making it more alive. And then the last book is what was not covered and is totally ignored by the Kingdom of Heaven, is the fact that, of course, the Kingdom of Jerusalem doesn't really end with the loss of Jerusalem. They hold Tyre, they get reinforcements, and ultimately the Third Crusade arrives. And Balian de Ibelin was incredibly important in this period. He was considered the leading baron of the kingdom. The Arabs considered him like a king, is what I think it was Imad, is it not Imad ad-Din? It's Baha ad-Din calls him like a king, I believe. And he was instrumental, of course. It was his stepdaughter who becomes the queen when Sibylla dies. His wife is, of course, then the queen mother. and he was considered the leading baron of the kingdom under Isabella. And he initially, because he opposes Guy de Lusignan, reasonably, understandably, he's on the other side from Richard, and Richard ultimately comes around and recognizes this man is so important and so valuable. He uses Balian as his envoy to Saladin, and it is Balian that negotiates the Treaty of Ramla, or sometimes called the Treaty of Jaffa, with Saladin at the end of the Third Crusade. And that's where the third book in the Jerusalem Trilogy ends. But I want to point out that there's a fourth book which looks at what happens thereafter.
Yep.
Because although Balian disappears from the what do they call it? The witness list of the Kingdom of Jerusalem in 1193, that doesn't mean he died. John, just to explain, John de Ibelin, for example, the old Lord of Beirut, disappears from the witness list of the Kingdom of Jerusalem after John of Brienne becomes king in 1210. He didn't die. He went to Cyprus. He then, he dies in 1136. He dies, which is, 26 years, a quarter century after he disappears from the lists of the Kingdom of Jerusalem for a while. So the fact that Balian is no longer on the witness list only says that he was not present in the Kingdom of Jerusalem. And he disappears at exactly the same time that his niece becomes Queen of Cyprus, at exactly the same time that his brother's son-in-law, I don't know what that relationship is, his nephew-in-law, is establishing the Kingdom of Cyprus. And he has a wife who is a Byzantine princess in a Byzantine island.
Yes.
To me, the most logical thing of what happened is that Amory de Lusignan calls on his wife's sister-in-law, essentially, his wife's aunt in this case, to come and help him get control of Cyprus, which was in rebellion, had thrown the Templars out. And that Balian and Maria spent the last years of their life in Cyprus, just as his son spent much, and his grandsons spent as much time in Cyprus as they did in Jerusalem. So, but that's all speculation. There's no historical data points to that. So the fourth book, it's not Jerusalem Trilogy because it's no longer the Kingdom of Jerusalem. It's called The Last Crusader Kingdom. And it looks at what happens and how the Lusignans established their kingdom on Cyprus. And it postulates what could have happened to Balian and Maria in their last years.
That's fantastic.
So it's actually part of a Balian biography, if you like, but it's I call it a bridge book because it also starts making Balian's eldest son, John. He's a young man, he's a squire, he becomes constable of Jerusalem at the end. So you have it's sort of John's growing up book and bridges to the next series, which looks at the baronial conflict with Frederick II, which we talked about earlier, which was the way, as I said, got inspired.
Okay, that really is fascinating, and especially the way you weave in all the family connections. And I think some of the best historical fiction series do something similar to this, kind of like what Rosemary Sutcliffe did with her Eagle of the Ninth, trilogy, or the Eagle trilogy, where you weave it in with a family and you kind of follow a family through a particular place through multiple different eras or time periods, although this one is very compressed. It's all pretty much within the same century, but it's you're establishing that very intimate connection between the place of Cyprus and the Levant and the de Ibelin family. I think that's fantastic.
Well, it's we've got to remember that in the medieval period, family ties were critical.
Everything. Yes.
It was this kinship ties made a difference. Doesn't mean you got along with all your siblings. It didn't mean that you didn't fight. And we have the Plantagenet brothers always as an example out there. It didn't mean that they agreed on everything, but family was family and blood was thicker than water.
Yes.
And dynasties were important, whether they were royal dynasties or noble dynasties, they were really important. Which is why and with the Ibelins, it's the Ibelins are called semi-royal. I just wrote a chapter. They were regents, they were constables, they were seneschals, they were on Cyprus, and in Jerusalem. Ebelins were regents of Jerusalem. They were regents of Cyprus. They were constables in both kingdoms. And they held, how many different titles? They held Ibelin, Ramla, Mirabel, Arsuf, Kemont, Beirut. Those are just the Jerusalem titles. And on Cyprus estates, the thing about Cyprus estates tend to get lost in the historical record because the barons continued to use their Jerusalem titles because they were more prestigious.
Yes.
But they held huge estates on Cyprus that were much more prosperous and were not being attacked and burned down by anybody. Yeah. So the Cyprus was normally the base of their wealth, but their title would be, Caesarea or Arsuf or Jaffa, but their base was actually in Cyprus. Wow. Okay. Wow.
That's fantastic. Yeah. Oh, I can. Yes. That's fantastic. Well, I guess I should save this for when we discuss future projects, but I do have some questions on that. We're gonna shift gears a little bit here and start talking about just advice for people who want to get into this. What advice do you have? How is it best to get started? What's best with subject matter selection, genre, style, and then what are some pitfalls and warnings that you would have?
The key to, of course, you have to start with a subject you love. It's got to come from the heart. The thing I say, I hate it when people say, I want to be a writer, but I don't know what I want to write. Then don't. Just don't. Nobody should say, I want to write historical fiction unless they've like me, they've seen something, they've gone somewhere, they've read something, they've fallen across a story that just makes them say, wow, how, why, how did that happen? And so I don't think you can do this in your head. I think it has to come really, really out of your heart. Once you have a topic that you want to write about and you're excited about, and I think it's better to have a person you're excited about than a thing you're excited about, because it's the characters that will make or break a book. If the characters are believable and credible, but also sympathetic, if there's something people can identify with and care about, then they will forgive you many other sins. But if you have wooden characters or unlikable characters or silly sort of comic book characters, then you'll never be taken seriously, and you shouldn't be, So I think I personally think that being fascinated by an individual is more important, or a person, than a place or an event. But whatever inspires you. I mean, okay, if an event really inspires you, then maybe you can discover the characters afterwards. The biggest pitfalls are that people tend to then do research only about the historical facts. And they don't realize that I can write a history by just listing facts. When I write a history of Cyprus, I don't have to tell you what people ate. I don't have to tell you what people wore. I don't have to tell you, about, the entire atmospherics of what the weather's like, or any of that. That's not important to a objective history of Cyprus. A novel has to go way beyond what you need for a nonfiction account, because you have to know very, very intimately what, as I say, the environment was like, what the weather was like, what the music was at the time, what people were reading at the time. But most important, you have to understand the social mores, what was possible, what was not possible, what the society, the religion, all of those things.
The daily life of what it, as much as we can know, what was the daily life like, in that.
Yes, and also not just the king and queen, and but what would their servants have been? Would they have been in Cyprus? Would they have been Greek servants, or would they have had Arab servants? Would they have had slaves? All of those, and it's so easy to get the sort of like the chronology right and get the society totally wrong, and that drives me totally crazy.
It's something I've noticed as well in bad historical fiction.
Yeah.
Usually what I find is, it's being written by somebody who has virtually no or they either have no knowledge of it or they don't care to portray the characters and the setting as it would have been back then. There's a lot of like injecting modern social and cultural mores into things. That just it's anachronistic, and any anachronism just stands out like a sore thumb. In bad,
and it immediately shatters the image, and when you shatter the image, it destroys obviously everything. If you're reading a story and suddenly somebody does something that's totally implausible and impossible, it immediately it's like, throw it out, go away.
Yeah.
I don't want anything more to do with this book.
Yeah.
But of course, you and I are people who know enough about the period to recognize it. I think that the danger, of course, is that if people are reading it's their first book of historical fiction or about a certain period,
yes,
they may not recognize those things.
It can give people a very misleading impression of
that's right.
What the real history was. And then they
absorb false. Yeah, the reader absorbs false information. So one of my little pet peeves, one of my soapbox offers, is that women were just chattels in the Middle Ages. Well, actually, no, women were lords. Chattel is slavery. Women were not slaves in the Middle Ages. They were not oppressed in the Middle Ages. Women could be rulers. They were lords. They were vassals. They commanded troops. A woman's social status was more important than her sex. And it's just like women in the Middle Ages were guild masters. They were they were doctors. They were surgeons. Women in the Middle Ages were incredibly powerful, and they were respected, and their voice mattered. And the fact that women, it comes in the Renaissance as women start to be oppressed. I mean, and you go back to Roman law, which is terribly misogynist, and it was the adoration of all things Roman in the Renaissance that leads to a horrible, denigration of women. But it wasn't true in the Middle Ages. And when I read books that set in the Middle Ages where women are being shown being abused and having no say, and it drives me so crazy.
Yeah. No, I'm glad you hit on that, because that is one of the most common tropes you tend to find, with people who don't, even in things that are complete fiction, like, is it like, I know I mentioned, the Game of Thrones, series with, George R.R. Martin, that's, there's a lot of sort of postmodern cynicism, social commentary, kind of thrown into a very medieval-esque environment. And again, you're right. It gives people a very mistaken impression of what that time period really was like in terms, especially for women, or for especially in the Crusader kingdom's case, for non-Christians, for the Jews and the Muslims and that lived in the Crusader states, and things like that. So, it really is fascinating, and I would absolutely agree with you that is a major pitfall to avoid. If you are going to write about a particular era of history, really get to know that era as it really was.
Any other really important questions?
No, I feel like that's it. In terms of maybe for people who are thinking about doing this, with like style or genre or just how they present their story, do you have any recommendations in that direction?
There's really sort of two routes to go if you're doing serious historical fiction, and one is to take real historical characters, which is my preference. And as I say, I think there's a huge advantage to that because you have that skeleton. The other route is to have completely fictional characters. If I'm writing a completely fictional book about, let's say, the American Civil War, I probably have enough information so that I can, with totally fictional characters, not make any major mistakes. But if I'm writing about, 12th century Jerusalem or, France and the First Crusade or whatever, I probably don't have enough information to know how the court system works, or to know how bishops get appointed, or there's a lot of things I probably don't know. But if I take a real character and I follow what they really did, I'm less likely to make major mistakes than if I try to make something up. I had somebody sent me a manuscript recently, and it was like, well, and then he gave his niece his barony as her dowry, and it's like, no.
What?
no, wait a minute. No. Baronies cannot be given away. You don't own them. You cannot dispose of them as you please. There are laws, inheritance laws. If they had been writing about a real person, they would have known exactly that they were the heir or how they were related, or they couldn't have made that kind of mistake. Okay. Because they would have been tied to that skeleton of fact. Okay. So I actually think it's easier to write about real characters. That said, I admit that when I was choosing who was going to be the hero of my second series, I chose one of the characters about which there is less information, because I had more flexibility in making him, in shaping him. In other words, the person we know the most about, of course, is Philip de Navarre himself, because it's his autobiographical work, which is our main source, our main primary source. But he wrote so much that, I couldn't create a character. That character was pretty much given to me, and that's a little bit frustrating to an author too. So, I think finding a character about which we know enough, we have enough skeletal facts that you won't go too far off the reservation, but not so many facts that you can't use your imagination, which is the case of Balian, of both of my Balians, is probably the best, focus. In terms of style, I think everybody has to write their own style. And I also think, we're all writing in modern English. If I was going to write in Crusader, French, nobody would understand it. So there's no point. There's no point pretending that the language we use is the language of our subjects. We are writing about, medieval subjects in a modern language. So you should use your language as best you can and to be as evocative as you can. But it tends to destroy people's sense of being in the Middle Ages if you start saying things like awesome and, there are certain phrases that people associate with, if you start talking, well, that's just fake news, people are probably going to feel like jolted out of that medieval environment. So there's a lot to be said for, you're using modern language, but try to use language that isn't associated with, shall I say, contemporary, society.
Contemporary slang or contemporary conversationalism. Right. Absolutely. And that's even something I've had to discover. And fortunately, I've had a lot of, because of my vast prior reading experience with several good, good examples of historical fiction, I've had some very good examples of how to do that. But that's even something that I've had to encounter even in my own adventures with historical novel writing. Of course, my period is a little bit after yours. Mine is more following mine's taking place during the 100 Years' War period. But so it's but it is, it's a you have to take modern English and you have to kind of package it in something that would make sense coming out of the mouth of somebody in the 14th century.
I was reading one of these manuscripts, and they kept using the word "okay," and I said, "That doesn't sound medieval." And it's like, educate. Well, what else can I say? And I sat there and I wrote. I think I must have had 15 different words for yes. Start with "okay" just means yes, fine, agreed, affirmative.
Yeah, exactly.
You don't have to say "okay" because "okay" is very clearly a modern expression.
Yes.
The same thing is, and it's an important point you say, we all make mistakes. That's something I would say to any writer, whether you're writing historical fiction or not. Recognize the fact that your first draft is only a first draft. Exactly. You aren't going to stop. It is not the last draft. It is never anybody's last draft. And the first draft should be, I say, for me, it's like eating tiramisu, because I happen to love tiramisu. It's like getting what are we saying? The caffeine, it's like getting a caffeine.
There we go.
Like
there we go.
It's something, when you're writing a new scene, it's so exciting because you're discovering things for yourself. At least I never know how a scene's going to end. I don't know. I know what I want. I have a structure, but not until I sit down and write and I give my characters free reign do I actually know what's going to come out. So that first draft is a rush of adrenaline and everything. But then you have to say, and then you have to set it aside and you come back to it and you say, oh, but I used okay, and I did this and I did that. And then you realize, okay, I got out the idea. Now I have to start wordsmithing. Now I have to start making that scene work for others. That first draft is when I get something on paper so that I know where I'm going with something. And then you rework it and rework it and rework it. And in a first draft, it's perfectly normal, for as far as I'm concerned, that you're going to use some things it's the way your brain, when you're thinking, you're trying to write something down very fast, you're going to end up using language that comes into your head immediately.
Yes.
But you have the next 10 drafts to polish that out. It's not that you don't ever use modern language when you're writing it. It's just you should never publish a work that hasn't been polished to the point where those anachronisms have been eliminated.
Absolutely. I think, and along with that, I would say, find a very good editor.
Oh God, yes. Nobody can edit their own work. Nobody. Absolutely nobody. In fact, I like having 2 editors.
Yes.
Because they tend to see different things and have different pet peeves and different little, fortes and weaknesses.
Although I would say, I think some of the best advice anyone could give to somebody who wants to embark upon writing their own works comes from a very obscure film that came out recently, but it was kind of about the later life of William Shakespeare. And as Shakespeare is tending his garden in retirement, a young man comes up to him and obviously kind of is trying to do the fanboy thing with him. And he looks up, Shakespeare, William is kind of irritated that he's been interrupted from his gardening. And he looks at the young man and he says, if you're about to ask me how best to become a writer, the secret is to start writing. So if it's something you want to do, especially if there's anyone in our audience who who's thinking about doing this, the best way to become a writer is to start writing, and just do it. Make the time to do it.
And that's why I say, accept the fact. Don't get yourself wrapped up around, but is that the right word? No, don't worry about the right word. The first draft is the scene. You're setting the action, the characters, and what's happening. How you say it is what you refine in later drafts. The first draft, and that I think too many people think that first draft, that I have to get the right words and it has to be clever. No, try to get the basic, the plot and the characterization right. Then you can start polishing the language. Yeah,
absolutely. Just real quick before we transition to audience questions, which we do have a couple. Do you have any? This is kind of where I was going to ask you about future projects, and I actually had one question in particular with regards to this. Are there any? Do you have any, along with whatever future projects you have scheduled? Is there any chance we might see some works that cover the later period of the Kingdom of Cyprus? I was thinking specifically like the Alexandrine Crusade with King Peter. And during the 14th century, I was wondering, do you have any plans to cover some of the later periods of Cyprus?
I don't, very honestly, but that doesn't mean they wouldn't happen, because I get inspired. When I come across a story that I like, then I can just change direction and go there. But what I want to finish the war between Frederick II and the Barons of Jerusalem. There's 2 more books in that series. That the first one, as I say, covers only the period of Frederick, basically Frederick's crusade, and then he leaves the 5 bailies on Cyprus, and it ends with the Eblins taking control of Cyprus again. Then the second book follows when Frederick sends his marshal and attempts to take over and besieges Beirut, and the Eblins are almost destroyed. And then they finally win the Battle of Argiti. And then the third book is the one, those 2 have been published. The third one follows the period in which the emperor tries basically to bribe people to go over to his side. So he stops trying to win militarily, and it's a lot of diplomatic maneuvering. Of course, that makes for poor reading. I know people generally don't like that. It's not as exciting as the battles. So it's going to be a difficult book to sell. I will write it the weekend. And the fourth book covers the Barons' Crusade, and you have Simon de Montfort and Philip de Montfort coming out to the Holy Land. And that's really important because I argue and contend that it was the barons of Outre-mer and their struggle against bad government and their fight for that expanded the franchise from the barons also to the commons. It becomes the example for Simon de Montfort in England, and that he goes back afterwards, basically with many of the constitutional ideas that he's taken from the Ibelins, and that's part of what. And one of the things that's incredible about this is that if you read any biography of Simon de Montfort, they say, and then he went on crusade, and when he came back, he did this, and they don't even mention the fact what he did on that crusade, or some of them don't even mention that he was proposed as a regent of Jerusalem, and they don't mention that he had a cousin who was married there. And it's like, oh my God, people, wake up! There's something going on here. But so I think the fourth book is incredibly important because there is the Simon de Montfort connection, and there's also some great battles because Balian of Beirut, the grandson of Balian de Ibelin for Jerusalem, actually wins the war. His father was the more honorable one, but fights only to a standstill. Balian's the one. His son is the one who takes Tyre and throws the imperialists out forever, and dies as regent of Jerusalem. So, but he's, as I say, he's a more controversial figure because he didn't pay as much attention to the law. He basically ignored the law and just, to hell with the law. I'm getting these people out of here. Those two books are very important to me.
Yeah, it's fascinating that you mentioned it was fascinating that you mentioned Simon de Montfort and his experience in the Holy Land too, because it in a similar vein, you often find this too with figures like Prince Edward, who later becomes Edward the First, Edward Longshanks, who
absolutely.
his almost year-long sojourn in the Holy Land, exposed him to the military architecture and the Crusader castles, which he then brought back to England and used to subject Wales. And the castles that are in Wales, Beaumaris, Canu, Carnarvon, those are all the designs of those castles were all inspired by
how much did he learn about the fighting box? How about mounted archers? What about the crossbows? There's all sorts of military technology that goes back to Europe. How much of that, Edward, but Richard of Cornwall. I mean, there's a series of people. Louis IX, by the way, was taking administrative reforms from Henry I back. There's some people learned things in the Crusader states and they took them back to Europe. There's a lot of fascinating things going on. So you're asking next project. So those are the two things that really burning on me.
Okay.
A project I have before I die is a project very, very close to my heart that I've worked on for decades and then left and come back to, and it's in my heart. Is a biography of Edward the Black Prince. As I say, I'm not what he said, a biographical novel of Edward.
Now you're talking my language.
in 4 parts. So as his heir, and then as the Prince of Wales, and then as Prince of Aquitaine, and then as the Shadow King when he's dying, but behind the good Parliament. Fascinating man. Also, I think his relationship with Joan of Kent has been so misrepresented and so horrible. Joan of Kent is basically raped as a 12-year-old by this bastard. And most people show it as the great love affair with this lovely girl. She was in love at 12 and she was forced to marry by the... No, she wasn't. She was raped. God damn it. He was a nobody. And he took advantage of her. And the reason she didn't protest when Salisbury married her was because she didn't want to be married to that bastard. And, so it's just, and she, anyways, so yes, I can get off from that. So that's another really important project, but I've decided to do that when I'm dying because I can't deal with the last book of Edward dying for how many years, unless I think it's part of my own coming to terms.
It took almost the better part of a decade for him to die. Because his illness first manifested in Spain when he was campaigning with Pedro the
Yeah,
Cruel at Najera. And then yeah, it was 9 years later when he finally does die, but it was a very slow, steady, debilitating. I know I've seen a lot of speculative writing from kind of medical historians who think that it probably wasn't dysentery at all. It was
it wouldn't have lasted
something
that long.
like it was possibly something like Crohn's disease, or maybe even a form of stomach or intestinal cancer. Something along those lines.
Good,
slow, very debilitating.
And in between, I would just have to put this out there. I am actually working, as you mentioned, I published on the Battle of Britain. It was an important book for me. I brought it out actually in 2007. And one of the few surviving Battle of Britain aces said it was the best book he'd ever seen on the Battle of Britain. Sorry?
That's fantastic.
So that made me feel like I owed it to him and to me to try to bring it out again. And that's what I did here for the 80th anniversary. But having done that, I got myself a little bit into there's two more. It's called Where Eagles Never Flew, and I've got this 2 pieces on grounded eagles, which is about 2 of the minor secondary characters, and then I'm taking the characters to the Berlin airlift, because it's another one of these topics I've written about and researched. As a historian, I've published nonfiction on it, and the story is just so incredible that I thought, okay, let's do it. Let's just go for it. So I'm actually sort of paused my Crusader stuff to do these late additional 2 books set in the 20th century. And then I'll go back to the Evelyn's.
Fantastic. Okay. That's I can totally sympathize with the I'll get this done before I die sentiment, because that's I think that's probably where my 100 Years War series is gonna turn into. That's you're
doing the other part of the 100 Years War though, right? The Henry V, or not?
No, the goal is to do the series across the entire conflict.
Oh, okay.
And the thread that's going to connect them all is I went back to what are called the muster rolls that are still preserved in parliamentary records, but they're essentially the bureaucratic records of all the men that signed on to go fight, both noble and common.
Records, right?
Yeah, it was their pay record.
It's the payroll.
Yeah, and it's really turned into a historical gold mine for those studying that period, because now we actually have the names of the commoners, the grunts, the common archers, the common men at arms, people like that, and I found a particular family name that it's one of the oldest they have on record, and there are members with this name that go all the way up to 1453 to the end. And so to me, that makes it believable that this was possibly, as it's been documented multiple times, that war was a multi-generational affair. For entire
Dishonor
families.
Not your mothers, now attest that those whom you called fathers did beget you.
Exactly. Yeah, and it's the war ended with the grandsons and great grandsons of the guys who signed on to fight the war back in 1337.
And then you can show how these wars enriched England.
Exactly. Yes.
The ransoms.
And it's really the story of just how much that war changed their world. And how society changed, how politics changed, how just everything, how culture changed, and you get to kind of see what Clifford Rogers calls that war being the midwife of the European nation state, and the very distinct
identity,
very distinct English identity that emerges, near the end of that war and things like that. So, but yeah, that's my. I mean, this is probably going to be like a George R. R. Martin. I will hopefully finish it before I die.
So. You know what time I do. So, but as you said, you were giving your own advice. Bring out something.
Exactly. Well, let me jump to some audience questions real quick before I let you go. Okay. I know we did promise dear Michelle from the last episode. She did ask us, and I know this doesn't really have much to do with our subject matter, but she did ask last time, and she asked again today, what do you think of the tolerance of Islamic Spain? What was it really like?
I don't think there's any evidence of tolerance. my book I always refer to is Dario, let's pull it out. Fernandez Moreira, which is The Myth of the Andalusian Paradise. And his sources, I mean, it's just hundreds of sources, most of them Arabic sources. And it's so overwhelming that, you know, I don't think after reading that, it shreds that.
Yes, and we've actually had the good Dr. Moreira on as a guest, I think several years ago. Back, I know you'll our viewers can find that video on our older channel, the original YouTube channel. I want to say that was back in like 2016. I want to say 2016, 2017 is when we interviewed him. But yeah, no, I would absolutely agree. I think the idea of the tolerance of medieval Andalusia has been vastly overstated in modern times, and it was, if what tolerance there was probably no different than the tolerance you would have found in medieval Christendom at the same time.
Well, less, considerably less so. I mean, you just look at, and this is the book I think is even more important, is Batnio, is The Decline of Eastern Christianity under Islam and from Jihad to Jimmitude, because she looks at the ideological and theological background for treating Jimmies the way they do. And it's really frightening.
Yes.
I mean, it really starts with Muhammad slaughtering the Jews.
Mm-hmm.
This is not, you know, Christ never slaughtered anybody. I mean, let's be clear about this. You know, the example of Muhammad is violent, and his followers go to violence, and the term Dar Islam, the realm of Islam, and the alternative word is the I'm forgetting it, but it's the abode of war.
Yes.
The definition of peace is when I have killed everybody or they have converted to Islam. There is no room for tolerance. There is no room for a peace treaty. It is against medieval Islam to have a treaty longer than 10 years, a truce longer than 10 years. You cannot make peace with people who do not recognize your right to exist.
Yes.
You cannot be tolerant to people, or there is no tolerance in a regime that defines you as less than human, that says your word is not valuable in a court. The Christian states, Crusader kingdoms let Muslims live by Sharia law, and they were judged in their own courts by Muslim judges. Jimmies, Christians in an Islamic country, were judged by Sharia law, and in Sharia law, their word was worthless.
Yes.
If a Muslim said yes and you say no, the Muslim's word is correct. It doesn't matter if you could prove it. It didn't matter if you had it on camera, which of course you couldn't because there were no camera. It didn't matter how much evidence you had. If the Muslim says yes, the Muslim says white, and you say black, Muslim is right. He is always right. By Sharia law, he is right. That is not justice.
Yeah.
That is not tolerance. So I think nothing of tolerance in the Andalus, which doesn't mean that there weren't some lazy, not very Islamic leaders who didn't live by Sharia law.
Yeah.
There were certainly periods in which people found it more useful not to be particularly fanatical. And another thing which Batior makes very clear is that it was often the Christian, tragically, the Christian and the Jewish leaders who were the collaborators.
Yes.
And who assisted the Muslims in oppressing their own co-religionists. Yes. There's no question that some Christians and some Jews benefited from Islamic rule, profited from it, lived well in it. They were collaborators with Nazi Germany too.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
It doesn't make that system good just because some individuals were able to profit from it. Mm-hmm. So, yeah, I mean, I can only urge you to read the good scholarly works, which are based mostly on, I mean, the most devastating quotes I found in most of these books are when you take Arab or Turkish sources that brag about how they humiliated and killed and slaughtered and enslaved and tortured and raped. I mean, Imad ad-Din's description of taking the slaves out of Jerusalem is just one of the most appalling, devastating, depressing works I've ever seen. And that's not Christians blaming the Muslims. It's Muslims bragging about how they humiliate and rape people.
They're in the culture that they had, that was actually seen as bragging rights. But Michelle did give us a follow-up question. She did ask, what books do you recommend besides Dr. Morera's?
About the Andalus, I'm not an expert. Stephen Roberts is the one. I mean,
I do know.
I'm just not. I don't know Spain. My whole focus has been the Crusader states, the Levant.
Yeah, and I do know Michelle. Probably one of the most important authors you could read would be Joseph P. Callahan. He's probably one of the foremost medievalist experts out there on the history of medieval Spain, medieval Iberia. And I know we have his work in our recommended reading list. So there are definitely those out there, and we can get more of those to you here.
Ask Jay Stephen, because Jay Stephen's really good on Spanish history.
He is, yes. So we have a couple of questions from our listener Dorothy Gaffney, who obviously I think she's a very big fan of your works. She's said that multiple times, but her first question is: great book series. Are all 3 paperback books of the Jerusalem Trilogy, are they the latest versions?
No. Balian and Envoy of Jerusalem have both been updated. The Defender of Jerusalem, I am behind on. I haven't done the updating on that. I hope to do that in the next 6 months. What's problematic at the moment, and it's a thing I've had with Amazon, is they're not showing the latest edition of Envoy. It's there. I think I tried to give you the link to my my own website, because
you did, and we did post that.
That goes to the new edition, but Amazon has this policy that the old edition had more sales, so their logarithms prefer to show it. And I'm saying, so you're showing an out-of-print book to your readers, so your readers are frustrated, and you're not showing the new edition, so it can't get sales, and because it doesn't get sales, it doesn't go up in the algorithms. And they said, yeah, that's right. And I said, no, that's wrong. No, there's something fundamentally wrong. You don't make money, and I don't make money that way. And our readers don't get to see what they want to read. But that's what's happening right now. So all I can do is say, please go to my website and either buy directly from Itasca or follow my link. It'll take you to the new edition. The new edition is the 2020.
And just for the benefit of our listeners, that website will be posted in the description of this video as well, so that you can all follow that to the latest editions of these of Dr. Schrader's trilogy. Our last question, and this may. Go ahead.
No, I was just saying the Balian doesn't have that problem because it had a different title, so it comes up on its own. So the Balian is the problem is only with Envoy because I didn't change the title.
Okay.
I didn't really change the title.
Yeah, this question may take us down a little bit of a rabbit hole, but it's again from Miss Gaffney. She asked specifically about the what medical analysis work, if any, did you do for the condition for King Baldwin IV?
That's Piers D. Mitchell. Piers D. Mitchell is the leading historian on Crusades medicine. He's written a number of works. He also wrote a appendix to Bernard Hamilton's biography of Baldwin IV, which was my main source. The other good source, excellent source, if you're interested in leprosy, is let me just check here. Walking Corpses.
Okay.
Which is
I've heard of that.
Timothy Miller and John Nesbitt, and it's really exciting because it looks at the Byzantine tradition and the Jewish tradition and compares it to Germanic traditions. So it looks at different traditions and how people had treated lepers and the religious theological treatment of leprosy in the Bible, etc. Very, very good book. less about the purely medical aspects, and then I have to say, I actually have a cousin who worked with lepers in the modern world, and in where I served in the Foreign Service. Leprosy was not eliminated from Ethiopia, and there were organizations there that were charitable organizations working with lepers. It was really strange because I was really so proud. I was saying, look, these have been made by lepers. These, this is taking senators. 6 American senators to a shop, and I was so proud of showing them stuff made by lepers, and they and they don't want to touch it. Oh, please don't do that to me. Please don't do that to me. Yeah, please. Okay. Yeah. So I've actually had that's not the since maybe that's why I'm interested, because I've had more contact with leprosy in the modern world than most people have, but the best medical source is Piers D. Mitchell's.
Piers D. Mitchell's. Okay, fantastic. I think that's really all we have. Dr. Schrader, do you have any closing comments?
Just the books, as I say, the what he wrote on leprosy is in Bernard Hamilton's biography of Baldwin IV. His other major seminal work is The Medicine in the Crusades, Warfare Wounds, and the Medieval Surgeon, which came out with Cambridge University Press.
And is that and that's Piers D. Mitchell as well?
Yeah, that's Piers D. Mitchell's, major, as I said, seminal work, came out in 2004 with Cambridge.
Okay, excellent.
So if you weren't familiar with that, that's my Bible on how they treated, breaks and puncture wounds and the anesthetics. Very strong anesthetics. No, they did not operate without anesthetics. They had local and general anesthetics in the medieval period.
Absolutely, and I've actually read some of the primary source medical manuals from the medieval period, or I've read the translations of them. So I am familiar with a lot of that. I'm also stories of the extraction of the arrowhead from Prince Henry, future Henry V, after he received the arrow to the face at Shrewsbury, and they surgically extracted it with John Bradmore, the royal surgeon. That story fascinates me. Yeah, no, I was not aware of the existence of that book, and I think you just increased my Amazon queue.
It's really worth having it. It's something I can refer. It's a book you can refer back to. It's a really good, source.
That's fantastic. Hey, Dr. Helena, thank you again so much for coming on. These last 2 interviews have been fantastic. I hope our audience has enjoyed them just as much. And really, thank you for all the great advice for hopefully any prospective historical fiction authors. And we will just continue to look forward to your future works. And as always, we'll be seeing you around Real Crusades history.
Yeah, thank you very much. Bye.
All right.